There comes a moment in every honest life when the soul grows weary of its own clenched fists. You may not notice it at first. It often disguises itself as diligence, as responsibility, as the noble insistence that if anything good is to happen, you must be the one to make it so. Yet beneath that busy devotion lies a quiet terror, the fear that if you loosen your grip, everything will fall apart. We tell ourselves that our worry is proof of love, that our anxiety is merely foresight wearing a darker coat. But worry, when examined closely, is not a sign of care at all. It is a confession of mistrust, not only in God, but in the goodness of reality itself. To let go is not, as many suppose, to become careless. It is not to abandon effort, nor to shrug at responsibility. Letting go is far more difficult than grasping. It requires the courage to admit that you were never meant to be the savior of your own soul. You were designed to be a steward, not a sovereign. And the tragedy of the modern heart is not that it fails to believe in God, but that it attempts to replace him with its own limited strength. We exhaust ourselves playing a role we were never meant to fill, and then we wonder why the burden feels unbearable. Trusting God does not begin with a feeling. It begins with a decision that often runs contrary to every emotion within you. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is obedience in the presence of it. There are days when trusting God feels less like soaring on wings and more like standing on the edge of a cliff, commanded to step forward while every instinct screams to step back. Yet it is precisely here, in this trembling obedience, that trust is born. For trust that costs nothing is worth very little, and trust that costs everything is the kind that reshapes a life. We must be honest about what we are truly afraid of when we refuse to let go. It is not merely that things may go wrong, it is that God may choose a path different from the one we have carefully mapped out. We fear that his will might lead us through valleys we would rather avoid, through losses we did not plan to endure. And so we negotiate with heaven, offering partial surrender in exchange for guaranteed outcomes. But God does not bargain like a merchant in the market. He invites us into relationship, not transaction. He asks for our trust, not because he is cruel, but because he sees what we cannot. Consider how often our greatest regrets come not from failures, but from the relentless effort to control what was never ours to command. We replay conversations, we rehearse disasters that never happen, we strain tomorrow through the narrow lens of today's fears. All the while, God stands patient, not offended by our weakness, but grieved by our refusal to rest. Rest, after all, is not laziness. It is an act of faith. To rest is to declare without words that the world does not collapse when you sleep, and that God remains God even when you are not managing every detail. There is a peculiar arrogance hidden in anxiety. It whispers that your worry is essential, that without your constant vigilance the universe would surely unravel. But the truth is both humbling and liberating. God has been sustaining the world long before you arrived, and he will continue long after you are gone. Your trust does not hold him up. His faithfulness holds you. When you finally grasp this, something within you begins to loosen, and the tight knot in your chest starts to unwind. Letting go often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. You are releasing familiar patterns, even if those patterns are painful. There is comfort, strangely enough, in predictable misery. At least it is known. Trusting God, on the other hand, leads you into uncertainty, and uncertainty frightens us because it strips away the illusion of control. Yet it is in this very uncertainty that faith finds its true home, for if you could see every step clearly, trust would be unnecessary. Faith lives in the fog, not because God delights in confusion, but because clarity too soon would rob us of dependence. You may say that you have tried to trust God before and were disappointed. Your prayers, it seems, went unanswered, or were answered in ways that felt like refusal. But trust is not a guarantee that God will fulfill your desires exactly as you imagine them. It is the assurance that he will fulfill his purposes, which are deeper and wiser than our immediate wishes. Often what we interpret as divine silence is actually divine restraint, holding back what would harm us, even as we plead for it with tears. When a child insists on carrying a burden too heavy for their small frame, a loving parent does not praise the effort and walk away. The parent intervenes, sometimes to the child's protest, because love is not impressed by self-destruction. In much the same way, God invites you to place your burdens into His hands, not because He is indifferent to your struggle, but because He knows the weight will crush you if you insist on carrying it alone. Letting go, then, is not giving up, it is giving over. There is also a quieter fear that keeps us from trusting God, the fear of being known. To trust is to open yourself fully, to stop presenting a polished version of your faith, and admit the doubt, the anger, the confusion. But God is not surprised by the contents of your heart. You cannot shock omniscience. He does not require you to clean yourself up before coming to Him. He asks only that you come. Trust begins when pretense ends. Notice how often we say we trust God while still clutching tightly to outcomes. We say, "I trust you, but only if this works." Out the way, I hope. That is not trust, it is conditional consent. Real trust says, "Even if this breaks my heart, I will still believe you are good." Such words are easy to admire and difficult to live. Yet it is precisely this kind of trust that transforms suffering from a meaningless weight into a refining fire. Pain does not automatically produce growth, but pain surrendered to God often does. Letting go does not mean you will never feel anxious again. It means that when anxiety comes, you no longer crown it as king. You acknowledge it, but you do not obey it. You remind your soul, again and again if necessary, that fear is a poor prophet and worry an unreliable guide. Trust is built in these small, repeated acts of surrender, not in a single dramatic moment. Day by day, sometimes breath by breath, you choose to place your confidence not in your own understanding, but in the character of God. There is something profoundly freeing about accepting your limitations. When you stop pretending to be infinite, you finally make room for the infinite. You were not meant to have all the answers, to foresee every danger, to solve every problem. You were meant to walk in companionship with God, listening, responding, learning. The burden of omniscience is not yours to bear. When you release it, you may find that your soul, long bent under its weight, begins to straighten. Trusting God today does not require you to resolve the rest of your life. It asks only for this moment, this decision, this surrender. Tomorrow will bring its own temptations to worry, its own reasons to fear. But grace is given in daily portions, not in overwhelming supply. God meets you where you are, not where you think you should be. And He asks for what you have, not for what you lack. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to trust is not doubt, but familiarity. We have grown accustomed to carrying our burdens, and they feel like part of who we are. To let them go feels like losing a piece of ourselves. But what if the very things you are afraid to release are the things preventing you from becoming who you were meant to be? What if God's invitation to trust is not a demand for loss, but an offer of transformation? When you look back on your life, you may notice that the moments which shaped you most were not the ones you controlled most tightly, but the ones you were forced to surrender. The plans that failed, the doors that closed, the paths that disappeared beneath your feet, these often became the unexpected beginnings of deeper faith. At the time, they felt like endings. Only later did you see them as mercy in disguise. Trusting God does not mean denying reality. It means interpreting reality through a larger story. The world is indeed broken, and suffering is real. Trust does not ask you to call evil good or pain pleasant. It asks you to believe that God can bring good even out of what He does not approve. This is not naive optimism, it is resilient hope. It is the conviction that no sorrow is wasted when placed into God's hands. You may find that as you begin to let go, resistance rises within you. Old habits protest, old fears demand attention. This is normal. Trust is not formed without struggle, but each time you choose surrender over control, something within you shifts. The grip loosens, the heart softens, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, peace begins to take root, not because your circumstances have suddenly improved, but because your confidence has found a new anchor. There is a quiet strength that comes from trusting God, a strength that does not shout or boast. It is the strength of knowing you are held. It allows you to face uncertainty without panic, loss without despair, delay without bitterness. This strength does not come from certainty about outcomes, but from confidence in God's presence. You are not promised an easy road, but you are promised that you will not walk it alone. Letting go and trusting God today may be the most countercultural act you can perform. The world urges you to hustle, to control, to secure yourself against every possible threat. God invites you to rest, to release, to find your security not in preparation but in relationship. This invitation is not given because you are strong enough to trust, but because He is strong enough to be trusted. And so you stand at the familiar crossroads between fear and faith, between grasping and surrender. You may not feel ready, you may not feel brave, but trust. Dazen. Wait for readiness. It begins with willingness. Even the smallest act of surrender, offered honestly, is enough to begin. You loosen your hands just a little and discover that the ground does not give way beneath you. Instead, you sense that you are being held, guided, and carried forward into a future that is still unseen, where God is already at work, preparing what you cannot yet imagine, shaping what you cannot yet understand, and gently inviting you to take the next step, even as questions remain unanswered and the path ahead continues to unfold, calling you to trust again and again and again, as the journey continues beyond this moment into the quiet unfolding mystery of what God is still doing in your life. And as you continue along that path, you begin to realize that trust is not something you graduate from, as though one great act of surrender should suffice for a lifetime. Trust is learned the way a language is learned, slowly, imperfectly, with repetition and correction, through daily use rather than sudden mastery. Each season introduces new words, new tensions, new opportunities to misunderstand God's intentions. And yet, through all these variations, the meaning remains steady. God is faithful even when you are faltering. He is patient even when your trust wavers between courage and retreat. There is a strange relief that comes when you stop demanding immediate explanations from God. We are tempted to believe that understanding must come before obedience, that clarity must precede faith, but often the order is reversed. Obedience clears the fog that understanding alone cannot penetrate. When you choose to trust God without seeing the full map, you begin to see just enough of the road to take the next step. The light, it turns out, does not flood the entire landscape. It falls only where your foot is about to land. This is where many turn back. They mistake partial illumination for divine absence. They assume that because God has not explained everything, He has explained nothing. But silence is not abandonment, and mystery is not neglect. God is not obligated to satisfy your curiosity in order to prove His care. He is shaping something deeper than your comfort, your character. And character, unlike answers, cannot be handed over in an instant. It must be formed through trust, tested by time. As you loosen your grip, you may become aware of how tightly your identity has been tied to outcomes. Success reassures you that you are worthy. Failure whispers that you are not. Trusting God begins to untangle this dangerous equation. Your worth, you learn, was never meant to be measured by achievement or approval. It was established long before you proved anything at all. When this truth sinks in, striving loses some of its frantic edge. You still work, still care, still hope, but no longer to earn love. You act from love, not toward it. There is also grief in letting go, and it deserves to be named. You grieve the future you imagined, the version of yourself you thought you would become, the timing you were sure God would follow. Trust does not require you to deny this grief. In fact, it invites you to bring it fully into God's presence. Lament is not the opposite of faith. It is one of its purest expressions. When you mourn before God, you are still turning toward Him, still believing that He is the right place to bring your sorrow. Sometimes trust feels like standing still while everything within you urges movement. Waiting can feel like weakness in a world addicted to momentum. Yet waiting, when entrusted to God, is not wasted time. It is hidden work, Roots grow in darkness. Strength is built in stillness. God often prepares you in ways you cannot see for purposes you do not yet understand. And when the moment comes to move, you may discover that the waiting was not an interruption, but an essential part of the journey. You may wonder why trusting God feels harder now than it did before. Perhaps you were once more certain, more confident, less aware of complexity. But faith that has never been questioned has never been tested. Childlike trust is beautiful, but mature trust is forged in fire. It has looked doubt in the face and chosen God anyway. It has wrestled with disappointment and refused to let go. This kind of trust is quieter, less dramatic, but far stronger than the untested confidence of earlier days. There will be moments when trusting God feels like foolishness. You will be tempted to measure wisdom by results and faith by visible success. But God's economy is not built on immediate returns. Some of the most faithful choices you make may look unimpressive, even wasteful to the watching world. Yet heaven measures differently. What looks like loss may be obedience. What looks like delay may be protection. What looks like weakness may be the very place where God's strength is most clearly revealed. As you learn to let go, you may find that control gives way not to chaos, but to peace. Not a fragile peace dependent on perfect circumstances, but a steady peace rooted in trust. This peace does not eliminate hardship, but it changes how hardship is carried. You no longer bear it alone. You carry it with God, who neither minimizes your pain nor allows it to have the final word. Trusting God also reshapes how you see others. When you are no longer driven by fear of loss, you become freer to love without condition. You stop clinging, manipulating, and grasping for reassurance. You can release people into God's care, trusting Him with their journeys as well as your own. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you compassionate without being consumed. Love, like trust, flourishes best when it is not forced. There will be setbacks, moments when you thought you had surrendered, only to discover that you were still holding on. This does not mean you have failed. It means you are human. Trust is rarely a clean, once-for-all decision. It is more often a series of returns, a continual choosing to place your heart back into God's hands after it has wandered elsewhere. God is not exasperated by this process. He is faithful within it. You may notice that as trust grows, prayer changes. It becomes less about persuading God and more about aligning yourself with Him. You spend less time arguing your case and more time listening, not because your desires no longer matter, but because you begin to trust that God knows how to meet them better than you do. Prayer becomes less transactional and more relational, less anxious and more honest. Letting go also requires humility, the kind that admits you do not see the whole picture. Pride insists on certainty, humility makes room for mystery. And mystery, though uncomfortable, is not an enemy of faith. It is a reminder that God is larger than your comprehension. When you accept that some things will remain unresolved for now, you stop exhausting yourself trying to solve what was never meant to be solved by you. There is a deep freedom in acknowledging that you are not responsible for holding everything together. You are responsible for faithfulness, not for outcomes. This distinction is subtle but life-changing. Faithfulness focuses on what is within your control, your choices, your obedience, your trust. Outcomes belong to God. When you confuse the two, you burden yourself with impossible expectations. When you separate them, you begin to live with clarity and peace. As days turn into weeks, and weeks into seasons, you may not notice dramatic changes. Trust grows quietly, like a tree whose roots deepen long before its branches spread wide. One day, however, you will face a situation that once would have undone you, and you will find yourself steadier than before. Not fearless, but grounded. Not certain, but calm. And you will realize that something within you has changed. Trusting God does not remove responsibility. It reorders it. You still plan, still prepare, still act with wisdom. But you no longer confuse preparation with control. You hold your plans lightly, ready to adjust when God leads in an unexpected direction. Flexibility becomes a form of faith. You learn to listen not only to your own desires, but to the quiet nudges of God's guidance. There is also courage in trust, the courage to obey when obedience is costly, to speak when silence would be safer, to remain when escape would be easier. Trust empowers you to live with integrity rather than fear. You begin to value faithfulness over approval, truth over comfort. This courage does not come from confidence in yourself, but from confidence in God's presence with you. You may still wish for guarantees, that is understandable, but trust does not thrive on guarantees, it thrives on relationship. God offers you Himself, not a detailed script of the future. And in the end, this is a better gift, for circumstances change, but God remains. When you anchor your trust in Him, rather than in outcomes, you discover a stability that circumstances cannot provide. Letting go also teaches you patience, with God, with others, with yourself. You stop demanding instant growth, immediate clarity, quick resolutions. You learn to honor process, to respect the slow work of transformation. God is not in a hurry, and learning to trust Him often means learning to slow down. You may look around and see others who seem more certain, more confident, more composed. Resist the temptation to measure your faith by appearances. Trust is not always visible. Some of the deepest faith is forged in private struggles, unseen acts of obedience, quiet decisions to keep believing when doubt presses hard. God sees what others do not, and He honors faithfulness that goes unnoticed. As you continue to let go, you may become more aware of God's nearness in ordinary moments. Trust sharpens your perception. You notice grace in small things, guidance in subtle ways, comfort in unexpected places. You realize that God has been present all along, even when you were too busy controlling to notice. There will still be questions. Trust does not eliminate them, but questions no longer paralyze you. They travel with you rather than stopping you. You learn to walk forward even while wondering, confident that God is not threatened by your uncertainty. And so the practice continues. Day after day, you choose to release what you cannot control, to place your confidence not in your own strength, but in God's faithfulness. Sometimes the release feels easy. Sometimes it feels like tearing something from your own hands. Yet each time, you discover anew that God is trustworthy, that His hands are steady, that His purposes are kind even when they are hidden. You are learning, slowly and imperfectly, that letting go is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a deeper way of living, one marked not by frantic effort, but by steady trust, not by anxious striving, but by quiet confidence. And as this way of living unfolds, you find yourself drawn further into the mystery of God's work in your life, aware that there is still more to learn, more to release, more to trust, as the journey continues onward, inviting you again into surrender, again into faith, again into the ongoing, unfinished work of trusting God today and every day that follows, as the path stretches ahead without clear edges, calling you forward into what has not yet been revealed. And in that unrevealed stretch of road, you begin to understand that trust is not passive resignation, but active participation in God's unfolding work. You are not drifting aimlessly, you are walking attentively, even when the destination remains unclear. Each step taken in trust is a quiet declaration that God's wisdom outruns your own, that His timing is not careless delay but deliberate care. This realization does not arrive all at once. It dawns slowly, like morning light that first softens the edges of darkness before fully dispelling it. You start notice how often your fear has been fueled by imagination rather than reality. The mind, left unchecked, can conjure futures that never come to pass, rehearsing catastrophes until they feel inevitable. Trust interrupts this cycle. It does not forbid thought, but it disciplines it. You learn to bring your imagination under the authority of hope rather than dread. Instead of asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" you begin to ask, "What if God is already at work in ways I cannot yet see?" This shift does not eliminate caution or wisdom. It simply relocates your center of gravity. You are no longer governed by worst-case scenarios, but guided by faith in a good God. And as that guidance grows more familiar, you begin to recognize his voice not only in moments of crisis, but in ordinary decisions, subtle promptings, and quiet convictions. Trust tunes your ears. It sharpens your awareness. It teaches you to listen. There is also a refining honesty that accompanies trust. You stop pretending that you are stronger than you are. You admit fatigue, confusion, and need without shame. Trust dismantles the exhausting performance of self-sufficiency. You no longer feel compelled to prove your resilience to God or to others. Weakness, once feared, becomes a doorway rather than a disgrace. For it is precisely there, in acknowledged limitation, that God's strength finds room to work. You may discover that some of your resistance to letting go has been rooted in disappointment from the past, promises that seemed delayed, prayers that seemed unanswered, hopes that seemed deferred. Trust does not ask you to forget these experiences. It asks you to reinterpret them. What if those moments were not evidence of God's absence, but of his protection? What if what felt like denial was, in truth, mercy concealed by timing? As trust deepens, your relationship with time begins to change. You stop viewing waiting as wasted space between blessings and start seeing it as sacred ground. Ere formation happens, the impatience that once gnawed at you loses its sharpness. You still long, still hope, still desire, but without the desperation that once accompanied those longings. You learn that urgency is not the same as importance, and that some of the most important work God does takes place slowly. There will be days when trust feels almost natural, when surrender flows easily and peace feels close at hand. There will also be days when it feels forced, when every act of faith feels like swimming against a relentless current. Do not mistake the difficulty of those days for failure. Resistance does not mean absence. Often it is a sign that something meaningful is taking place beneath the surface, unseen but significant. You begin to understand that trust is not a feeling you wait for, but a posture you adopt. Feelings follow, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is choice. Again and again, you choose to believe that God is good, even when circumstances argue otherwise. Again and again, you choose to place what you love into his hands, even when releasing it feels risky. This repeated choosing shapes you more than any single emotional experience ever could. Letting go also exposes the subtle ways you have tried to manage God rather than know him. You may have approached faith as a formula, assuming that correct behavior would guarantee predictable results. Trust dismantles this illusion. God is not a mechanism to be mastered, but a person to be trusted. Relationship replaces control. Love replaces leverage. And though this feels less secure at first, it proves far more sustaining in the end. As your trust grows, you may find yourself less reactive and more responsive. Situations that once provoked immediate anxiety now invite prayerful reflection. You pause before panicking. You breathe before deciding. This space, small as it may seem, is evidence of transformation. It is where trust quietly asserts itself, creating room for wisdom to emerge. You also become more tolerant of ambiguity. You no longer demand that every tension be resolved immediately. You learn to live with open questions without allowing them to erode your faith. Mystery becomes something to dwell within rather than escape from. And within that mystery you find that God is not distant or cold, but present and attentive. Trust reshapes how you understand success. Instead of measuring life by visible outcomes, you begin to measure it by faithfulness. Did you obey when it was difficult? Did you love when it was costly? Did you remain when it would have been easier to leave? These questions begin to matter more than applause or achievement. You find yourself satisfied by integrity rather than impressed by results. There is a gentle courage that grows in this soil of trust. Not the loud bravado that insists on being seen, but the quiet bravery that endures unseen. You become willing to do the next right thing without knowing where it will lead. You step forward, not because you are certain of success, but because you are confident of God's presence. You may notice that trusting God gradually loosens the grip of comparison. When your confidence rests in Him, the progress of others no longer threatens you. Their victories do not diminish your worth, nor do their paths dictate your own. Trust anchors you in your unique calling. freeing you from the restless need to measure yourself against anyone else. There is also a surprising joy that emerges as control recedes. It is not constant happiness, but a deeper gladness rooted in freedom. The freedom of knowing that you do not have to orchestrate every detail, anticipate every problem, or carry every burden alone. Joy grows where trust takes root. Because joy flourishes in surrendered soil, you begin to see that many of your prayers have subtly shifted. Where you once asked primarily for change in circumstances, you now ask more often for change in yourself. You ask for wisdom, patience, courage, and trust. Not because circumstances no longer matter, but because you have learned that transformation within often matters more than alteration without. Trust also teaches you to recognize God's faithfulness in hindsight. Looking back, you begin to see patterns that were invisible at the time, connections you could not have planned, redirections you resisted but later understood. You realize that God has been guiding you even when you doubted his nearness. This retrospective clarity strengthens your present trust, giving you courage to release what you cannot yet understand. There will still be moments of resistance. Old habits of control do not disappear overnight. Stress may tempt you to reclaim burdens you once surrendered. When this happens, trust invites you not into condemnation, but into return. You come back again and again to the simple act of placing your concerns before God. There is no limit to how often you may do this. Trust is renewed, not exhausted, by repetition. As you continue this journey, you may find that trusting God does not make life smaller, but larger. Your world expands as fear shrinks. You become more willing to risk love, to pursue calling, to step into opportunities that once felt too uncertain. Trust emboldens you not because it promises safety, but because it assures you of God's companionship. You may also become more attentive to the present moment. When you are no longer consumed by anxiety about the future, you can fully inhabit the now. Ordinary moments take on new significance. Conversations deepen, gratitude sharpens. You recognize grace woven into daily life, not as an occasional interruption, but as a constant presence. Trusting God does not erase suffering, but it does redeem it. Pain becomes a place of encounter rather than isolation. You find that even in hardship, you are not abandoned. God meets you there, not always with explanations, but with presence. And presence in time proves to be enough. You begin to understand that letting go is not a one-time act, but a way of living, a daily posture of open hands. Some days your hands open easily, other days they tremble as they release. Both are acts of trust. God receives them with equal faithfulness. As this way of living takes deeper root, you may feel less driven to define yourself by fear or failure. Your identity becomes anchored not in what you can manage, but in who God is. This anchor holds steady even when circumstances shift. You are not immune to storms, but you are no longer unmoored by them. Trust gradually transforms your expectations. You stop expecting life to be easy and start expecting God to be present. This expectation is quieter but stronger. It does not depend on favorable outcomes. It rests on relationship. And relationship, unlike circumstance, cannot be taken from you. You may still ask questions. You may still wrestle. Trust does not silence inquiry. It simply refuses to let inquiry replace faith. You learn to ask while still believing, to seek while still surrendering. These are not contradictions, but companions on the path of trust. And so you continue, step by step, learning what it means to release control and receive grace. You do not arrive at a final state of perfect trust. You walk in an ongoing invitation, renewed each morning, to place your life again into God's hands. This invitation does not grow stale. It deepens with time, drawing you further into reliance, further into freedom, further into the quiet, persistent work of trusting God today and tomorrow and beyond, as the journey stretches on, unfinished and unfolding, calling you forward into what remains unseen, where trust is still being formed, still being tested, still being lived out in the ordinary, unremarkable moments that together shape a life surrendered, a life still in progress, a life learning again and again to let go. So let this be the quiet turning point where your clenched hands finally open, not in defeat, but in trust. You have carried enough, worried enough, tried hard enough to prove that you could manage what was never meant to rest on your shoulders alone. Now you are invited into something gentler and stronger, a life anchored not in control, but in confidence, not in fear, but in faith. Letting go does not mean the road will suddenly smooth out, but it does mean you will no longer walk it alone. As you release what you cannot hold and entrust what you cannot fix, you discover that God has been holding you all along, and in that holy exchange, your surrender for His faithfulness, you find the courage to move forward, the peace to breathe again, and the assurance that whatever lies ahead, you are safe in the hands of a God who is worthy of your trust, today and always.